Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. It was on May the 9th, 1950, at 6 p.m., that the French Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house in which today 500 million Europeans live together in peace. This is why we have these Schuman Talks on the 9th day of the month at 6 p.m. This was the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched the European movement for peace and unity that's led to today's European Union. Now, Schuman's vision for Europe was for a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. Schuman, along with his Italian and German colleagues, Alcide de Gasperi and Konrad Adenauer, was a devout Catholic believer, schooled in Catholic social teaching, and related to the popes of his day. And the occasion for tonight's Schuman Talk is the death and funeral of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, and our guest is Bruce Clewett, who has been working in YWAM Kerygma Teams. That is the branch of Youth with a Mission that's really engaged with the Catholic world, starting in Austria. So I want to welcome a very old colleague and friend, Bruce Clewett. We've worked together for decades. And welcome, Bruce. You've actually been part of the mission now for 52 years, I think.
Yep.
And you went off with Annette Kirkby to pioneer the work of YWAM in Austria. Unfortunately, Annette passed away at a very young age. And you were actually going to what was widely understood as the graveyard for Protestant missions in Austria at the time. Now, in the meantime, things have changed enormously. We want to hear that story a little bit from you as we go along. But you yourself, just for the clarity for our listeners, you have a Presbyterian background. You're still part of the fellowship that you belonged to before you joined YWAM. And yet you've been heavily engaged with the Catholic Church, not only in Vienna, but in different parts of the world, particularly in Europe. And we want to hear more about that, your story, Bruce. But our starting point is going to be looking at the legacy of Cardinal Ratzinger, who then became Pope Benedict XVI. And what, from your close observation, has been the significance of his life and ministry, not just for the Catholic Church, but also for the whole body of Christ, Protestants, Orthodox as well. From a Protestant evangelical perspective, what has been his significance, not just as a pope, but as a great Christian thinker? So you've been much more involved in some ways with Pope Francis. You'll tell us more about that as well. But let me start off with this question. When you heard that Cardinal Ratzinger had become Pope Benedict XVI, what went through your mind?
Oh, I remember the day. I remember the time of day. I was together with a friend of mine was in charge of training the deacons for the Archdiocese of Vienna, a really close friend.
The Catholic
Johannes Fichtenbauer. We were devastated. We thought, oh, God. And the reason for that is because up to that point, he was known mainly as a very conservative person. He had written a few documents. I don't know if we'll go into this, but the most devastating for us at the time was one called Dominus Jesus, which he wrote while he was a prefect for the Congregation of the Faithful, which is the kind of the watchdog group over theology, in which he basically
back in the years was the kind of the tool of the Inquisition, wasn't it?
So the office, no longer is, obviously, but
and of course the media had attached to him the title of God's Rottweiler, and
that's right, the bulldog, the Rottweiler, etc. And so we were just devastated. We were hoping for something else, and Well, as it turned out, I don't know if I should go into this yet, but we talked later to a friend of ours who's the Cardinal of Vienna, a guy named Cardinal Schönborn, the editor of the Catholic Catechism, who's, I'd say, a very close friend and confidant, who was at the conclave. And we asked him these two questions. We said, what do you make of this? And he said, number one, he said, believe it or not, we in the conclave felt the presence of God before we made this vote. There was a very strong...
When you say the conclave, explain what that means.
That's where that's where the different cardinals get together. And, you hear this thing about the smoke, the white smoke and the black smoke. It's where they decide together. They keep taking different votes until they come to a consensus of who the next pope should be. And Cardinal Schönborn said it became very clear on us. I really felt this presence of Holy Spirit. It became very clear that this was to be the next pope. And he said, and by the way, I'm a close friend of this man. He was my professor of Christology at the university. Now, that's quite saying something, because another friend of ours, Walter Dürer, who used to be in YWAM for years, took Christology classes from Schönborn, and he's a Protestant, a Reformed like myself. And he said, there was this real sense, again, they're using these words, of the presence of God whenever Schönborn talked about Christ. And of course, later, this particular Pope wrote 3 books on Jesus. And his dying words were, I love you, Jesus. There was something about this. So that was the beginning of, it wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of a changing of our minds. That we thought, well, maybe we've got this wrong. And over the years, we discovered we got it really wrong.
So what, in your view, then, has been his legacy? If you got it wrong, if your negative first impressions were false impressions, what are the positives of his legacy? There's a lot of people who like to look at what he was against, but what was he for?
Well, first of all, to mention why the negatives come, he is first and foremost a theologian, probably one of the main academics of our time. I mean, a really brilliant man, but he was not very good. He was a bit awkward in politics and even in pastoral care. And so he let loose statements that lended themselves to misunderstanding, and without thinking it through. Well, he thought it through, I'm sure, but didn't phrase it in ways that would say what he was trying to say. And so I need to say that. So getting back to this point about Dominus Jesus, in it, he made the statement, there's only one true church, and that is the Catholic Church. All these other ecclesial communities are not true churches. Now, that sounds terrible unless you go back to the context. And the context is the Second Vatican Council's teaching on what the church is, where the Catholic Church made a major change in their definition of church. It used to be the church is the Catholic Church, and Second Vatican Council, they said, no, subsists in the Catholic Church. In other words, the Catholic Church is closest to the center of what God wants for church, but there's kind of rings going out, other groups that belong to this, but they're just not as close to the center. And that's really what he was saying. He's saying these other ecclesial communities have salvation. We can learn things from them. We can work with them. They're just basically, I mean, this is my wordage, not as close to the true core of what the church is as we are. So there's ecclesiological differences, but this is significant. That's what he meant. Part of his legacy, well, he was, even before he became Pope, he had a legacy that was quite something. He had written a few things, for example, on the future of the church that were quite prescient. I think you're going to show some of that a little bit later. He's written. Then he started dialogues with, very curious dialogues with thinking atheists and agnostics, and it got their attention. They had never had a pope that was willing to dialogue in this kind of way. And he
So here
basically
you've
said,
got people like Jürgen Habermas. I think we've got a
people like Jürgen
on the
Habermas, which is
slide,
quite something. Yeah,
the
this
dialogue
is,
here, who's been had a Marxist background, considered to be one of the world's leading philosophers, and these two men dialogued and surprised both their constituencies. Is that correct?
that's exactly correct. And then
Why were
while
they
he was,
surprised?
sorry, what?
Why were they surprised?
They were surprised because the Catholic Church generally did not do this. It was simply, here's the border. You're either Catholic or you're not. Here's the border. You guys are outside the box. We'll talk to you, but we're talking from within our protected area. And he stretched that whole thing out. I mean, it was quite remarkable. He also produced 3 books about Jesus, which are recognized by many preeminent Protestant theologians as the best works on the person of Jesus.
On the previous slide,
slide you showed that. Those are it's actually consists of 3 books, and they're very thick theologically, I have to warn you, but very, very good. If you like that kind of thing, very, very good. Secondly, one of the things that he was accused of was being against the Second Vatican Council. I don't have time to go into what the Second Vatican Council was. I can say it's called by John the 23rd into being between 63 and 65, and it was basically an attempt to modernize our understanding of what the Catholic Church teaches, and quite a few radical things came out of that. And Benedict was
in the vernacular instead of in Latin.
Yeah, vernacular, but many other things concerning the attitude towards laity, the attitude towards non-Christians, the attitude towards other kinds of Christians, the attitude towards just a whole plethora of things changed here. And we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but this was dramatic. And he was been accused of kind of pulling the brakes on this, and that is absolutely untrue. I need to say to our audience, it's absolutely untrue. He was one of the advisors of Vatican II and was very influential in the formation of many parts of Second Vatican Council. He emphasized again and again there, and then later as a pope, the absolute importance of a personal encounter with Christ. This is significant. It was kind of a precursor to what Pope John Paul II used when he talked about the new evangelization. And both of them, as well as Paul VI, started using the term metanoia, talking about conversion. This came into being again. Mission, conversion, personal encounter with Jesus, and even the term missionary disciples. I mean, it opened the door to dialoguing in a way that was very, very new for the Catholic Church. He was kind of behind that. Again, I mentioned his talk on the future church, and perhaps one of the most important things that he did was little known. Was under his papacy that the Selam, that was these are the bishops of South America, were commissioned to take several years and put out a paper talking about why so many South Americans left the Catholic Church. As I think we all know, the evangelicals, especially the Pentecostals, have been on a meteoric rise in that continent, and they just wanted to find out why. And so they interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who had left the Catholic Church and asked them why. That's all. I mean, very courteously, but they wanted to know why. I took notes. And they found out, I've written this down here, they found out 5 things, main things that they put together in this document. The Apocrypha is about 500 pages long, so I'm just trying to really shorten it. They said, first of all, they came up with the fact that people left the Catholic Church because they said they never experienced a personal and profound encounter with Jesus like they had in the evangelical churches. And they said this has happened through clear evangelistic talk, which they never heard in their church. Secondly, they said they missed the presence of meaningful community life where people are accepted, feel valued, visible, and included. Thirdly, they said they missed biblical and doctrinal formation not as theoretical and cold knowledge, but something that brings about spiritual, personal, and community growth. Fourthly, they said what they were missing was missionary commitment that involves church members from their pews to go out and meet those on the periphery, to bring people home to the family of God. So finally, they put together their statement at the end of this was, and I'll read it. In section 225, they noted, in our pastoral experience, often sincere people who leave our church do so because of what non-Catholic groups believe, but fundamentally for what they live, not for doctrinal, but for vivencial reasons, not for strictly dogmatic, but for pastoral reasons, not due to theological problems, but to methodological problems of our church. So there was a switch that was made, and they said, you know what? We can do these things. Now, this commission was led by Cardinal Bergoglio from Argentina, who's now the Pope. And so a lot of the language that was formed here was taken on when he became Pope later. But significant was this was presented to Pope Benedict, and he received it with great ecstatic joy. You should read the letter when he did it. He said, this is fabulous. This is really, really good, you know. And they made this document a magisterial document, which means it has to do with the whole of the church, not just with one area. And so it was recommended that this is for the whole of the church.
Now, back in 1969, he was writing about the future of the church.
Yes.
And perhaps it's good for us to look at what he was saying there and realize he understood the church was going to go through a pruning time. Here, the future of the church can and will issue from those whose roots are deep and who live from the pure fullness of their faith. It's not going to issue from those who accommodate themselves merely to the passing moment, or from those who merely criticize others and assume that they themselves are infallible measuring rods, blah, blah, blah. Next slide, it says, what will remain is the Church of Jesus Christ, the church that believes in the God who has become man, who has become man and promises us life beyond death. Let's go a step further. From the crisis of today, the church of tomorrow will emerge, a church that has lost much. She'll become small. We'll have to start afresh, more or less from the beginning. She will no longer be able to inhabit many of the edifices she built in prosperity. As the number of her adherents diminishes, so it will lose many of her social privileges. In contrast to an earlier age, it will be seen much more as a voluntary society entered only by free decision. We're not listening here to a traditionalist who wants to turn back the clock to Christendom.
No.
And then he goes on and says, as a small society, it will make much bigger demands on the initiative of her individual members. It will discover undoubtedly new forms of ministry, will ordain to the priesthood approved Christians who pursue some profession, and so on. The church will be a more spiritual church, not presuming upon a political mandate, flirting as little with the left as with the right. It'll be hard going for the church, for the process of crystallization and clarification will cost her much valuable energy. It will make her poor and cause her to become the church of the meek. The process will be all the more arduous, for sectarian narrow-mindedness as well as pompous self-will will have to be shared. One may predict that all of this will take time. But when the trial of the sifting is past, a great power will flow from a more spiritualized and simplified church. I mean, this is back in 69. And he was realizing there were going to be huge changes taking place in the church. So, yeah, you drew my attention to this. You want to comment further on it?
Yeah. I mean, this is passed on to some of his disciples, including Cardinal Schuman. I remember Schuman standing up at a large conference for workers from the whole of the diocese, and he had a smile on his face when he said this. He said, well, the number of Catholics remaining in the Catholic Church here in Austria is like everywhere else in Europe. It's going down like the Grand Canyon. It's sinking. But he said, interestingly enough, the number of active Catholics, and he defined this a little bit later, but active Catholics is actually increasing 2 times faster than the birth rate. He said, we're seeing kind of a division now. The death, and he said, use these words, the death of the Volkskirche and the birth of a decision-based church. Now,
Wow.
That's the kind of talk that evangelicals perk up and say, what? This is, you're saying what? And it's a great fact. So rather than Schadenfreude, that many evangelicals have, see, we always said it was right, you guys are doomed to whatever. I see it as a sifting process where God is doing exactly what Ratzinger was talking about back then.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned him being one of the, if not the leading Christian theologian, also as a philosopher. He also earned the nickname of being God's philosopher, and that God is the God of the philosophers. And that's where he relished the opportunity to expose the false premises on which so much of the world's thinking was based. And it would seem that one of his legacies is that whereas his predecessor, John Paul II, mainly engaged with the communist world, Ratzinger, or Benedict, really took on the secularism, the rationalism of our time, the relativism, the humanism, and showed that he liked to talk about the three-legged stool of foundations for European civilization, which was Athens and Rome and Jerusalem. And yet, that so often, without Jerusalem being, if Jerusalem leg was taken away, that is the Judaic-Christian foundation, then the Greek leg of rationalism would go very wobbly, which is the way he would put it. And he does a great service for all Christians. That's not the Pope.
No, that's God trying to get a hold of me.
Okay. That's a little in joke that perhaps we should explain here. One of our YWAM colleagues. No, we'll come back to that story about the Pope calling.
One other thing that just somebody had actually coined this phrase. There's in one museum there's a picture of John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis, and underneath them there was titles given. One was said under Pope John Paul II. It said, "This is what we believe." Under Benedict, it was, "This is why we believe it," and under Francis was, "Now go out and do it."
Yeah.
It's kind of a good description of the three guys.
Yeah. Well, John Paul was considered to be like a town crier to the world, warning of amnesia concerning God and the annulling of his law, whereas Ratzinger was the fireman who climbed out on the ledge to talk the world down heart by heart. And this is why I think he wasn't comfortable with all the diplomacy and so on. He was extremely precise in his theological and philosophical language, far more so than the news people could really understand. And so that's why they went for cliches and labels and characterizations about him. You mentioned the name of Bergoglio, much more widely known today as Pope Francis. And most of our listeners would be probably familiar with the film, the Two Popes. And here we see the depiction of two men in conversation. You might want to make some comment about that film. How accurate was it all? But also, would you comment on, when we compare these two people together, what were their strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, I love the film. I mean, unfortunately, it was about 2 years ago I saw it, so there's a little bit of holes in my memory of it. But it did present Benedict in a little bit more of a negative light than it probably should have. I mean, a lot of the comments that came out directly afterwards from kind of knowing Catholics, they said this, but I found it hugely entertaining, very much worth watching. And I think the gist of how they relate to one another probably is very close to how it might have been. You know, I think there was a lot of brotherly, fraternal relationship. The only two things that do need to be mentioned, that these are a little bit dangerous, is the producer was obviously a little bit left-leaning, and therefore he pointed out two things in the section of the film you might remember where they both made confession to one another. Bergoglio, who later Pope Francis, was asked for forgiveness for not trying to help victims of the Argentine junta, and that's actually not true. He did not ignore the charges. He did not ignore this. He was actually active in trying to help the victims. I won't go into that. The other thing was regarding Benedict. He confessed that he didn't do enough to hold back this Mexican priest who founded Regnum Christi when they found out about his sexual improprieties, and that's also not true. He did a lot to try and put investigations against him, etc. But other than that, I really like the film. But those two things, they're a little bit dangerous, and obviously, if you're a leftist, these are two caricatures. You know, saying, "Well, you know, you didn't help the left, you guys." That wasn't really true.
Did this meeting actually take place? I think it's set in 2005, and Bergoglio is actually coming to tend his resignation because of his feeling of vulnerability concerning his relationship with the junta. And so here, Ratzinger, or Benedict, who's being played wonderfully by Anthony Hopkins, actually doesn't even give him the opportunity to kind of present his resignation. He keeps talking about other things, and despite their differences, they begin to they find a connection. How much of that actually took place? Was Bergoglio wanting to resign back in 2005?
It's hard to say when he wanted to resign. I have my doubts if it was that early, because that's 2005, I think, is when he was installed, wasn't it, as Pope? I doubt if it was that far along.
Who? Ratzinger?
Yeah. I don't have that. Date.
No.
I thought it was closer to 2005, but I might be wrong. Yeah, who knows?
He was 8 years, and I think it was 2012, wasn't it? We should
2013. Yeah. Anyway.
13, so 8 years before that. Yeah, 2005. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if they had this talk or not. I don't think anybody knows, but it is a realistic thought that this could have happened, and that's why it's not a complete fairy tale. I think there's a lot of realistic thought behind it. So I don't know what else to say.
Well, you mentioned the conclave. The second highest number of votes, of course, went to Bergoglio.
Yeah.
And so the
statement from Cardinal Schönborn at that time was it was too early for him. That's what he said he said it was too early. Cardinal Schönborn knew both men. As a matter of fact, you might remember, Jeff, when you were visiting us and visiting Cardinal Schönborn in his office, and Lynn Green asked, is there anybody that thinks like you in South America? Because we in Youth of the Mission have had real problems with the hierarchy in South America.
That's right.
And Schönborn thought for a moment. He says, yeah, one guy that I know, at least. I know him quite well. He's a good friend. And he thinks just like me. And he wrote down the name Cardinal Bergoglio.
Now, that's kind of interesting because there is a YWAM connection there in Buenos Aires, because in the same apartment building where the Cardinal was living, the YWAM leader for Argentina, Alejandro Rodrigo,
Rodriguez.
Rodriguez. He was. That's where they had their prayer center, and through that, actually, the cardinal came up for prayer, and the YWAM has tried to engage in theological debate, but that's not what he's interested in. I just want prayer, and I've heard from. I was at a meeting in Rome with Catholic leaders, and there was an Argentinian Pentecostal pastor who knew the Pope very well, and said he was the man who would wash our feet. He was a servant. He was, and spoke very highly of him. And this is actually how this relationship developed with the YWAM leader, Alejandro. And when your phone went off a little while ago, it reminded me of a story that Alejandro told us about. He was speaking at a YWAM conference in India, I think in Calcutta, when his phone went off several times, and he was teaching, so he turned it off. And eventually, when it went the third time, he said, look, would you excuse me? This is actually the Pope calling me. And I should probably tell him. And he answered the phone and said, listen, I'm right now, I'm teaching. Can I call you back? And then I hung up and said, well, that was the Pope. So that's the sort of common, the no fancy airs man that Pope Francis seems to be.
Yeah, Francis, from what I understand, does not have nearly the theological depth that Benedict had. On the other hand, he's a Jesuit. People need to remember, although he calls himself Francis, which makes it look like he's a Franciscan, he's not. He's a Jesuit, and he's a very, very clever man. Very little of what he does is not thought through. This is probably, and he made it one of the things. I don't know if it's through his contacts in South America. It probably is. Both his contact with Ricardo, but also many other Pentecostal leaders. It was there apparently that he asked for prayer to receive a new infilling of the Holy Spirit, and it changed his life. And the other thing he did was, you probably know, he asked Ricardo to come 2 or 3 times a year to be an advisor to him in Rome, and he's given a lot of input. And thirdly, this Pope, more than anyone else, has reached out to non-Catholic Christians. He's made it a real point to try and bring reconciliation. One of his first acts was to head down to a small Pentecostal church south of Rome to ask for forgiveness for what the Catholic Church had done to the Pentecostals in their country. And he's been greatly misunderstood through some of these. This, of course, incensed the conservative branch of the Catholic Church. This incensed them. Plus, because he's not so precise in his theological thinking, he started stretching the borders, saying, well, what about this? And he very much a pastoral person. And so when you read statements he makes about things like sexuality, like dealing with Protestants, dealing with the poor, it's all mainly from a pastoral perspective, which has its weaknesses because it sometimes maybe oversteps theological borders, but it's all very pastoral, and that has to be remembered. This is a pastor like probably no one else in the last many, many decades, etc. Doesn't mean that these things are always right. It just means this is where he's coming from.
Before we explore that further, I just want to track again back on Benedict. He played a very key role in building the bridge between the Protestant and Catholic thinking on the doctrine of justification. Would you explain what that was?
Yeah, that was before he was Pope, when he was still a prefect for the Congregation of the Faith. And they had a meeting in southern Germany together with the World Lutheran Foundation. It wasn't actually his office that was there. I think I wrote a couple of notes about this. I did. It was the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity and the Lutheran World Federation. They met together to try and explore the whole concept of justification. And the thing they came up with, and it was a lot harder than people think. This took a lot of work. And finally, Benedict, or Ratzinger at that time, decided, he says, why don't we move the meetings to my brother George's house, and where it was a lot more, beer flowing and a little bit more loose and personal. They finally came to a conclusion.
That was in Regensburg, right? I mean, they were meeting in Augsburg in the St. Anna Church, which is where Luther actually was lodging when he had to come and meet the cardinal of those days and recant. And then his brother was living up in Regensburg, I believe.
Yeah, and they anyway, at this place there was a real breakthrough. And again, anyone can call up the text, etc. And it basically said the Catholic Church has agreed officially that we are saved through faith, that we are justified through faith. The terminology is quite significant and nuanced. I know that, Jeff, you sent a newspaper article where he made a statement, well, Luther was right. No, I don't believe he said it that way at all. But he basically, in a very nuanced way, said, we realize that what Luther had said back then about justification, that actually is not against our teaching. We just need to, there's a language problem here and a few other significant things that needed to be adjusted. And they put it together, and it was quite dynamic, I guess. Now, the other thing I need you to know, this a little bit later, other churches jumped on board. The World Communion of the Reformed Churches and the World Methodist Council jumped on board of this. The Reformed congregations consist of Presbyterians, Reformed, United, Waldensians, and there was others as well, I heard later.
Even the Anglican Global Communion has affirmed it. It's not.
They've affirmed it. Yeah, they've affirmed it. So, on the other hand, there was a lot of antagonism on the part of particularly conservative Christians. A lot in the United States and some other places. No, Catholics and Protestants.
Okay, yeah.
Both sides, Catholics as well. The conservative Catholics said, no, wait, this is going too far. They just felt their world is coming apart, Here he is reaching out in this way. But it was very, very threatening, still is. I won't go through names of bishops that have tried to oppose this, or also some Protestants that were leery. But in general, it is a very significant document that laid the foundation theologically for talking about what it means to be justified through faith in Christ.
Yeah. There was a spiritual testament unsealed just after Benedict's death.
Yeah.
We have a slide with that. Would you just take us through that?
Yeah, okay. He said, this is towards the end of his statement. The statement was a lot longer, where he thanked his parents and friends and did a few other things. And here it says towards the end, stand firm in the faith, don't be confused. It often seems as if science is capable of delivering irrefutable results at odds with Catholic faith. I have lived through the transformations of the natural sciences for a long time, and I have seen how, on the contrary, the apparent certainties against faith have vanished, proving not to be science, but philosophical interpretations that only seem to be the competence of science. This is really important, because if anybody could say that, that's this man. For 60 years, I've accompanied, now he's talking about theology now. For 60 years, I've accompanied the path of theology, especially the biblical sciences, and with the successions of the different generations, I have seen collapse these theses that seemed immovable and turn out to be mere hypotheses. The liberal generation, Harnack, Jülich, etc., the existentialist generation, Bultmann, etc., the Marxist generation, and I have seen and I see how the reasonableness of faith has arisen from the confusion of hypotheses, reemerges. Jesus Christ is truly the way, the truth, the life, and the church, with all our insufficiencies, is truly his body. This is a very powerful statement. And like I said, when just before he died, a nurse heard him say, as his last spoken words, "I love you, Jesus." Or some said, "I love you, Lord." It's not clear which one it was, but it was something to the tune of, "I love you, Jesus." This is a man who maintained a personal relationship with God.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's focus now more on what you have seen changing in your own experience within the Catholic Church. And we'll start with a photo of a very smiling Pope Francis, who seems to be very happy to greet someone who looks very remarkably like you.
Yeah, it's
And
my
I
Android.
Charles Christmas in between you there, who's
Charles Whitehead, yeah.
Whitehead, sorry, right, yeah, Whitehead, who headed up the international, what was it, the Catholic Charismatic Committee, Renewal Committee.
Yeah.
Yes. So explain this photo.
Well, in 2017 was the 50th anniversary of the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. And so the Pope Francis he's a very excited charismatic person, you know, he really loves charismatic, all things charismatic. And so he invited people to come to Rome to celebrate for a week with him in 2017. And in addition, he invited what he called bridge builders, people that were working with Catholics and Protestants. I'm sitting there just behind the Pope is Rainaro Cantalamessa
to
with
the left
beard.
of the Pope's head in the row behind with a white shirt. That's you, right?
Yeah. In front of me is Rainaro Cantalamessa, the preacher to the Pope.
With the white beard. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, when he took these guys on stage, he also changed the poster in back. It was much more Catholic before, and he wanted it changed for this section and to make it Jesus is Lord, and that was the main profession that he made of this particular thing. So he had us come out. It was a great honor.
You took a photo from where you were seated, right? And I think that's
I took that. Yeah. I took that, and I took the next one too of the panorama of the people. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Now this was not in the Vatican.
This was at the Circus Maximus. There's a few reasons for that. One had to do with space, but another one had to do with church politics. He didn't want to, there's still factions in the Vatican that are very much against his ecumenical thinking. And so he said, okay, we don't need to have it at St. Peter's. We'll have it in the Circus Maximus where all these martyrs were. We'll sanctify the place. And that was one of his goals. So this is where all these Christians were martyred during the Roman days. It was packed. You should hear the worship, even though it was in different languages. It was quite dramatic, I have to say.
So 50,000 people there from 128 nations. And of course, this was not just the 50th anniversary of the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. This is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, Martin Luther's revolt. Yeah. And so this is, according to the text here, he said, today's martyrs are not asked, are you Catholic, Orthodox, Coptic, Pentecostal, before being killed? They're killed because they're Christians. We are united by this ecumenism of the blood.
Yeah. Good for you to get that quote. Yeah, he did say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you were chosen as one of the bridge builders.
Funny enough, though, Jeff, because I'm a YWAMer, when we know his main assistant, someone named Julia, he had a very, very favorable picture of YWAM, not only through Ricardo, but in general, from what he's heard, probably through Schönborn and others. And when he heard what I was doing as a YWAMer, he wanted me on the stage with him, with this illustrious group of people. So you YWAMers out there, you need to know this. This is where he stands right now. I don't know how come he's so positive. We know all of our problems, but this was part of it.
Well, do you want to comment further about how the Roman Catholic hierarchy think of YWAM these days?
Yeah, it's different. You have to, there's not a unified thinking among bishops. There's no higher position in the Catholic Church than a bishop. Most people don't realize that. The Pope is simply the Bishop of Rome, therefore he has more clout. But bishops are really leaders. You don't get a higher leader than a bishop, and therefore they're fairly independent of one another often and make their own thoughts. So, but I have seen a growing number of bishops in the last decades that not only have taken note of YWAM, but really like YWAM. As a matter of fact, we ran a Catholic program in one of our bases in Germany not too long ago, and we asked the local bishop, is this okay if we run a Catholic program in this YWAM Protestant base? They sent down 5 people from the diocese to check it out. At the end, one of the representatives had tears in her eyes, and she said, thank you so much for doing this in our diocese. Can we send people to this, please? I'm not kidding. This is a new world, you know, and I've been invited by different bishops to speak. Another bishop, also in Germany, was invited to speak and train his theologians and priests and others. In the United States, we have good relationships with some bishops. We do in parts of Africa. In Europe, it's growing really well. A lot of countries have growing numbers of bishops, but these have to be approached one at a time. You don't, just because some bishops say this is great, doesn't mean that other bishops will say this is great. And so a couple of examples. We created a program. We in Kerygma, together with some others, created a program. It's basically a mini DTS for Catholics. It's 8 weekends, spread over 14 months. We made a manual, and it's basically YWAM. If you look at it, it's basically YWAM material, but with a little bit of a twist. And this is probably almost certainly going to get the Nihil Obstat, which is a local bishop saying this is authentically Catholic. There's nothing, we have nothing against any of the details of this. We need to know as YWAMers, we don't have to hide who we are. We have to sometimes learn to get into the culture and understand how to say these things. But my years of working as a YWAMer in the Catholic world, I found the content of what we are and what we have, it fits really well in a Catholic context. It's extremely well. One other thing I should mention, we helped start another thing. This guy Johannes Fichtenbauer, who I've mentioned earlier, and I started networking Catholic communities or fellowships together in different parts of Europe. These are little groups within the Catholic Church that are recognized by Catholic bishops almost everywhere as good things. I won't go into details of what these are unless you want later. But we've networked a bunch of these across Europe. In the meantime, it's over 100, I think, with about 10,000 people. In Ukraine, we have, I think, 40 communities alone. So this thing's grown monstrously, and we've been asked by the Vatican to be the representatives of ecumenical communities worldwide. That means if a group of Catholics and Protestants want to form a fellowship together, that they can look to us to do this. And Johannes Fichtenbauer is one of the main 8 theologians in the Vatican now, overseeing this process of switching from the charismatic to renewal to what they now call charis. Charismatic renewal used to be over all the charismatic prayer groups. Charis is a little bit larger in that it includes communities and movements. And the current president of the ENC, the European Network of Communities, Johannes Fichtenbauer, is one of the 8 theologians in charge overseeing this thing.
So again, Johannes was the right-hand man for Cardinal Schönborn. He was the head deacon for the Viennese diocese, right? Yeah. And he's very close.
Just like we do.
You and Johannes are been the drivers at the beginning of this network of ecumenical communities. Now, refer a little bit to what's been happening in Salzburg. We have a photo of you here with the Archbishop of Salzburg, and that beautiful lady there is your wife, right?
Yes, that's
Esther.
my wife.
Yeah. Tell us about this.
About my wife?
Yeah. Well, I know you'd like to tell us more about that.
Okay, well, yeah. Yeah, no, Franz Lachner, as a kid, was involved in a lot of our YWAM things. As a matter of fact, from what we understand, I don't know this for sure, but I've heard he gave a testimony once where it appears he might have made a commitment of his life to Jesus at one of our camps. So he attended several camps, he attended several outreaches. He even went with our group down to Spain, 1982. Played Jesus, in Toymaker and Son.
Oh, the dramas.
This Archbishop of Salzburg, Franz Lachner, and later became the Archbishop of Salzburg, a good friend. He might even become the speaker for the Bishops' Conference now that Schönborn is stepping back. Very influential. Austria only has 2 archbishops, Archbishop of Vienna and Salzburg. The rest are just bishops. So he's got a lot of clout, and he's a good friend. And I would encourage, YWAMers are afraid many times to meet with leaders, thinking we're still dispensationalist a little bit in our thinking. If something's big and powerful, it's got to be evil. And I would really encourage you to change that thinking. Going through a bishop is, you don't ask him for permission. Going through a bishop, he's not a door. Bishops are tools. We do things that God calls us to do because he tells us to do it. But by sometimes cooperating or working with a bishop, it allows the thing to be wider. We found 2 keys in changing the church in a nation and internationally. First of all, build something local, a model, together with other Catholic groups, a model that can be multiplied. And then your contact with the leadership of the church allows it to be multiplied. So first of all, have to have something to look at that these bishops can see, and they can say, this has got hand and foot. But it's through then our contact with the hierarchy many times that can be multiplied. And we've seen, honestly, you guys, major changes in parts of the Catholic Church through this way. We've seen the introduction, for example, of the term lay missionary. That, to our knowledge, this was not a term before we started using it more and more, we are influencing strongly, at least in Central Europe, an understanding of what a lay leader is to do. This is up until 1960s, lay people were not allowed to take spiritual responsibility for things. It was forbidden. It was only for others. Now, since
up to Vatican II,
Vatican II opened the door up for lay people to be able to take spiritual responsibility, but they don't know how to do it. This is over exaggerated, but many do not know how to do it. And that's part of our arsenal in many of our evangelical circles and in our YWAM circles, is training leaders to train leaders. And thirdly, discipleship. We have an ability to create a structured form of discipleship that can be passed on, just like Alpha created a structured form of evangelism that can be passed on. We in YWAM have created something dynamite. Honestly, we don't know the treasure we have in our understanding of discipleship in a formation in this way, with small groups, with teaching, with going and doing it, and this kind of stuff. And we are influencing the Catholic world in terms of their understanding of how to make disciples.
Yeah, tell us about the Loreto meetings, because that's a disciple movement.
Yeah, Loreto is interesting. It's a very interesting situation. I've spoken there a few times during Pentecost. Now they don't meet in the church anymore because it's too small. They were only able to pack 10,000 people in and outside. They had tents set up outside the church as well. These are yearly meetings at Pentecost, and it's mainly evangelistic. So they cleverly thought, listen, Pentecost is the main time where Catholics, get confirmed. So why don't we invite all these young people to a large meeting in Salzburg? And the high point of it is the confirmation of all of these kids. So others, of course, not just kids come, etc., but they have this huge meeting with the speakers almost irrelevant. The fact that I've spoken there a few times shows that fact. Nikki Gumbel has spoken there. The head of 24/7 Prayers spoken there, and a few others. And just before the day where the confirmation takes place, they give a very clear invitation to give your life to Jesus, put yourself under the lordship of Jesus. And honestly, you guys, Esther and I sat there weeping as we saw hundreds and hundreds of kids stand and try to make their way to the front, which is difficult because you see they've clogged the aisles. It was very difficult. Took up to 20 minutes to get to the front. Hundreds came to the front and got hands laid on them, gave their lives to Jesus. And this Loreto movement has a plan for what to do with these guys. They actually form communities across, and as a result, they become the biggest youth movement in Catholic youth movement in Central Europe, I think in all of Europe. They're just quite large, and I have to say they're very, very, very close friends of ours. It started through us running one of these discipleship programs for about 11 students, Wirtschaft, what's that? Economy students in Vienna. They wanted us to run this course. Cardinal Schönborn had encouraged them to contact YWAM, and we said no. And they looked at us and they said no. It was one of those kind of meetings. Here's a bunch of guys wearing ascots, and blue bloods and rich people, and very strong with Mary. And in fact, they got started through a pilgrimage to Medjugorje. And here's us YWAMers, wearing jeans and the kind of stuff that we wear. So we first of all said no. They said no. We thought about it, prayed about it. We came back and we said, okay, under certain circumstances. And as a result, we ran this program and it was dynamite. Honestly, Jeff, it was dynamite. It changed everything. It spawned suddenly this movement. And one of the key things is we have a weekend towards the end of this training on vision. And we prayed, we asked God, Lord, how do you want Austria to look in 5 years? How do you want what part do you want us to play in this kind of questions? They wrote these really, really highfalutin big things on the board. I mean, it was unbelievable. We want to be involved in music. We want to be in every province. We want to be training leaders. They wrote these impossible things. And 10 years later, everything that they wrote on the board happened. Everything. It was quite dramatic. The other thing that Georg Meyer-Melnhof was the figurehead of this whole movement. He said, Bruce, despite everything else, you guys taught, it was great. But the main thing takeaway for me was when you said, as soon as we come into leadership, one of the first things we have to do is looking for future leaders and train them. That was an absolutely new thought for them. And that's been their forte. They have been very, very good at training leadership and raising up leaders. So we like those guys. It's an interesting mix. They still like Mary more than I do. But they're very evangelistic. They're very ecumenical. They're very unafraid of inviting even the most radical free church figures. They'd probably even invite you, Jeff, believe it or not. But yet we have a very close friendship bond. I'd say they're our best friends in the country.
So, Bruce, this you've shown us some amazing photos and told us some amazing stories, starting from your first efforts moving down to Austria. And just as you've described Pope Benedict as being a pope who's often misunderstood, I think in your own mission, you've been misunderstood too, accused of teaching Catholic doctrine in YWAM schools. And of course, we teach what Muslims believe as well. Now, what have been some of the key missiological realizations that helped you unlock the life that you've been describing now? I mean, we talk about entering into an unreached people group, and how we can look for the communication bridges. If we are approaching the Catholic world, we're trying to make evangelicals out of all the Catholics. That's just extremely bad missiology. What have been some of the key turning points in your own thinking that have enabled you to see the life of the Spirit unleashed in this way?
Well, I have to answer that with a little example. As you can tell, I work with kids, so I use examples quite a bit. If a Dutchman was going to Japan for the first time, didn't know anything about Japan, he'd go there and he'd be struck by the differences. But the main two differences he would probably see would be, first of all, the language. It's different. And the food. The food is quite different. But there's a lot of similarities. Buildings, the highways, the cars, the way people are dressed, a lot of similarities. And if he's not careful, he would probably think the main differences between us and the Japanese is food and language, and that's it. And of course, that's a total oversimplification. You can send a group of YWAMers or others into Japan that don't know much about the culture, and they can do a lot of good. But if you want to change the country, you got to go deeper and find out about the culture of the place, the culture and history. And one of the missiological keys for us was finally getting down beyond the theology, because theology is not the main division point between Catholics and Protestants. I want to say that clearly. There's differences, but it's certainly not the main division. Culture is. And so we spent a lot of time digging into the culture and the history, and discovered a form of being able to communicate that's culturally sensitive to Catholic minds. That took a lot of work. In the early years, we oversimplified. I remember we said, go to YWAM Protestants, just take these 8 points and you go out and do it. And it was a catastrophe. Now we say, if you want to change the country, if you want to change the situation, it's a lot of work. Are you willing to do this kind of work? So that was number one. Number two, Peter Hawken, who you would know, was a mentor of mine. He was a professor and author of many books, and a charismatic guy. Yeah. And he said, you can't have unity until you have respect. And you can't have respect if you don't know much about the other person. So therefore, he said, the first step to unity is not just praying for the others. The first step is getting to know the other side. That was a key, because if you asked most YWAMers about the Catholic Church, its teaching, what it is, you'll get a whole bunch of really weird stuff that isn't really true, on this. So that was a key of spending the time doing that. Thirdly, another thing that helped us was realizing, because of Catholic culture, they are more comfortable receiving teaching on their turf than on our turf. Now, this is not the same for evangelicals. We kind of like things to happen in our own denomination, but it's not necessary. For Catholics, there's a high feeling of uncomfortableness if they're receiving authentic teaching on turf other than their own. That meant we had to learn to make YWAM programs fit into a Catholic context, rather than saying just come to our DTSs. Therefore, you're always going to get some YWAMers or some Catholics coming to your schools, but the main influence you're going to have is doing things on their turf. And we found we could take the DNA of YWAM and plant it in a Catholic context, and it's dynamite. I mean, the expansion is absolutely enormous. You saw Loreto. That's just one of many, many, many examples that we've seen over the years. And that takes a little bit. That's a challenge for us YWAMers, because we like to have things. We like to be in charge of things. We like to have others follow our lead. We like to do something and say, okay, we've got this cutting edge idea, join us and you can be part of this as well. But not being able to take the credit like this, it takes an awful lot of humility. In other words, being an influencer. In the Catholic world, influence is everything. One of the examples we believe we had from God was the example of Joseph and Pharaoh. Joseph never became the leader of Egypt. but his influence, even though he's persecuted initially by the Egyptians, also by his own brothers, by the way, but his influence had to do with his training leaders. And we found that is exactly what I think our call in YWAM is do. We have you were asking earlier in the talk, what are some things that we and Protestants can give to Catholics, and what can Catholics give to YWAM? One of the things that we have as our treasures, evangelicals, is a few hundred years of leadership development. This is something, again, that's brand new to the Catholic world, and I would encourage our listeners to consider forms of leadership development in a Catholic context. It's doable, and we've seen the fruits. And like I said, one of our fruits is now the Archbishop of Salzburg. I mean, it's possible to have major influence beyond your size of who you are. I don't know if you want to go that way now in terms of what we can learn from one another, but
this has been extremely stimulating, starting with Benedict and his legacy, and then going on to understanding where things are changing. So let's just finish off with these thoughts. Indeed, what can for myself, when I was appointed European Director for Youth with a Mission, and I began to look around for evangelical mothers and fathers with God's heart for Europe, and the first realization I came to was that we don't go there. Evangelicals didn't think in terms of a European framework. But where I did find biblical thinking about it, surprise, surprise, was coming out of the Catholic world, and this Catholic social thinking that started with a biblical understanding of human beings created in the image of God, and therefore you start from a point of every human being with sanctity and dignity, and that was the whole basis for any human rights and the way of which nations should relate to each other and so forth. And that's played such a huge role that the vast majority of Europeans have got no idea where or the source of the values that have helped to make the process of European integration move ahead. And so we've had to realize there is so much we need to learn from the Catholic Church and other streams. And you've already unpacked a lot in terms of how the Catholics feel they can learn also from other parts of the body of Christ, and they've shown themselves since Vatican II to be open to do so. And we need to recognize from our evangelical Protestant side that sometimes we've been wrong and others have been right. You've taken us on a fascinating tour, and we could talk a lot more about this all, but I think our time is coming to an end. I want to thank you very much, Bruce, for your faithfulness and persistence in pursuing this mission field, even though you are often misunderstood by your fellow YWAM leaders as well. I've been in a number of meetings where those misunderstandings were quite heatedly discussed as well.
Me too.
And I think what you've just shared about is shows that there has been a wonderful deposit in what used to be, for example, the graveyard of Protestant missionaries. You've talked about the two archbishops, both strong supporters and friends of Youth of Mission. And that is a great credit to your faithfulness and persistence, and you and Esther working together there with others. So I want to thank you very much, Bruce, for all you've shared tonight, and in your honoring of Pope Benedict, and also for Pope Francis. And so let's round off here, and I just want to say thank you, Bruce, and we invite our listeners to join us next month as well on the 9th of February, where we continue to discuss issues that we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. Now, while I am usually based in Amsterdam, right now I've been talking to you from Auckland, New Zealand, my mother country, and where I have arrived a few days ago. We hope to celebrate my mother's 100th birthday on February the 4th, And just 5 days later, we'll be together again for our next Schuman Talk. Thank you for joining us tonight.